Hey everybody, KMO here with the third and final video in the Perception Gap series. Now, I hope it's clear, none of this research is my own. I have nothing to do with it. I just happened upon a study. I'll tell you how I happened upon it toward the end of the video. But it's just a study that an organization did that I found fascinating, and I thought I'd share the results with you. So in the first two installments of this series, I told you that, the perception gap is the gap or the difference between what we believe the other side believes and what the other side actually believes. And on both the left and the right, for Democrats and Republicans, we tend to attribute fanaticism or extreme beliefs to the other side to a much greater degree than they actually embrace those extreme beliefs. The worst faction in terms of exaggerating or overestimating how extreme the other side is are uneducated Republicans. But the second to worst faction, the faction which, after uneducated Republicans, is most likely to attribute fanaticism inappropriately, are the most educated of Democrats. So Democrats with postgraduate educational experience. Uneducated Democrats and educated Republicans are less likely than either uneducated Republicans or highly educated Democrats to misattribute fanaticism to their political opponents. The more news media you consume, the larger your perception gap is likely to be. People who consume very little news mostly get their impressions about what other people believe by actually interacting with other people. But the more news media you consume, the more likely you are to think that people on the other side are extremists. Now, not all news media is equivalent in terms of its effects on our perception gaps. The worst are things like AM talk radio and highly partisan online sources like Huffington Post, Slate, Gizmodo, or on the other side, Breitbart, Red State, the Drudge Report. These are the worst. These are just the worst. If you read any of these, you are basically, pouring sewage into your brain. But I know it feels good, so you'll probably keep doing it. Some of the least distorting news sources are Christian news sources, surprisingly, like the Christian Post and Christian News Network. And if you still watch the nightly news on NBC, ABC, or CBS, you're actually getting pretty decent news, at least on this issue, the issue of understanding what people whose beliefs are different from yours, what they actually believe. Now, the diversity of your friendships has a lot to do with your perception gap. So if you basically surround yourself with people who think the way that you do, well, you're likely to be misguided in terms of what people other than the ones you surround yourself with believe. Now, people who post to social media, really only 26% of Americans post political stuff to social media. But those 26% who do, their perception gap tends to be 11 points bigger than people who use social media but don't post political stuff. So think about this. On social media, who is going to have the most distorted view of the other side? It's going to be people who are highly educated Democrats who post a lot of political content. They are the ones who have the densest, most resilient, most distorting filter bubble in social media. Now, that's not entirely true because still uneducated Republicans are still going to be the most rapidly misinformed. But if you're watching my video channel, chances are, to encounter the political posts of people in that category, you'd have to go and look for them. You'd have to be deliberately looking to either get pissed off or to find evidence for your conviction that, the red state knuckle draggers are subhuman and awful and terrible and really shouldn't enjoy the rights of free speech or the freedom to assemble, and certainly they shouldn't have the right to keep and bear arms. So one more graphic. This one, judging one's opponents, this is a percentage of both Republicans and Democrats who said that particular characteristics apply to people on the other side. So say for Republicans, the statement is Democrats are honest. You had to give that statement, the likelihood of that statement being true, a score of 1 to 7 on a 7-point scale. If you scored it 4 or higher, then the other side, in your perception, has this attribute. So, honest. 24% of Republicans thought Democrats were honest. Brainwashed. 86% of Republicans said that Democrats were brainwashed. Reasonable, 17%. Hateful, 84%. Caring, 31%. Racist, 71%. 71% of Republicans who were quizzed thought that Democrats were racist. Well, let's see how the Democrats fared when talking about Republicans. Brainwashed, 88%, almost identical to what Republicans said. Everybody thinks anybody who disagrees with them must be brainwashed. Honest, 26%, still within 2% of what Republicans said about Democrats. Hateful, 87%. Reasonable, 20%. Racist, 89%. Caring, 19%. So the conclusion is, what can you do about it? Well, one thing that is important to say is that, like so many other problems, it's not practical, it's not functional, it's not fair to lay it at the feet of individuals and say individual people must change their mindset, their practices, their way of living, the patterns of association in order to fix this problem. There has to be an institutional approach. But in terms of what an individual can do, one thing you can do is cultivate a more diverse information diet. That's hard to do if the only thing you can think of is to just go and watch or listen or read something that you expect to disagree with. It's a challenge to force oneself to do that. It's a worthwhile challenge, but it is a challenge. It really requires a dedicated effort. So I haven't been doing this up to this point, but I am going to read just a little something from this study. This is from the conclusion. Each of us can play a role in bridging the perception gap. We can choose a wider range of news sources to better understand different perspectives. We can refuse to be manipulated into outrage by reducing our exposure to social media feeds that amplify the views of the partisan wings, rather than the exhausted majority. And finally, we can seek to build connections with people who think differently from us. Directly engaging with people whose experiences and views differ from our own makes it harder for us to see them as the enemy. Now, here's probably a little unexpected twist at the end. And this is not from, the perception gap study or report. I was thinking back to Noam Chomsky. I first became aware of Noam Chomsky in the 90s with the movie Manufacturing Consent. And in that movie, and I've heard him repeat it many times since then, Noam Chomsky said that his favorite media outlets are the business press, because the business press is fundamentally honest. They know that most people don't read it, and so they can speak directly to their audience without sugarcoating it. Their audience wants to make money. The business press understands that they are talking to a particular class and that it is a secure channel, because people who don't have money are bored to tears by the business press. They don't bother with it. And so you get a sort of honesty there that you don't get in other mainstream outlets. So when I say the business press, what outlets do you think of? Wall Street Journal? How about the Financial Times? You familiar with the Financial Times? The Financial Times is Noam Chomsky's favorite media outlet. Or so he said when he was interviewed by the Financial Times back in 2013. Noam Chomsky said that it is the only global newspaper that tells the truth. Quote, "My impression in general is that the business press is more open, more free, more often critical, less constrained by external power and external influences. I guess that's also true for the reporting in the Wall Street Journal and Business Week, although the range of opinion that appears is different. So, for example, in the Wall Street Journal, and there are exceptions, but overwhelmingly the coverage is constricted and very reactionary. And the Financial Times has a much broader range, more terse, and I find it more instructive." And then, skipping ahead a bit, Noam Chomsky continues, "Those who Adam Smith called the masters of the universe have to understand the universe. They have to have a tolerably realistic understanding of the world that they are managing and controlling. That's true of political elites as well, but the business world particularly. Also, the business press essentially trust their audience. They don't have to impose propagandistic illusions to keep the rabble under control." So consider this. Noam Chomsky says that, a news source that will tell you the truth because it respects you is the Financial Times. Well, get this. This whole perception gap study came to my attention because I had signed up for a 4-week $1 trial subscription to the Financial Times. I thought, well, maybe the Financial Times isn't unique in offering up this perspective. So I went to the NPR website and I searched for perception gap in quotes. They hadn't covered it. I searched the New York Times. They hadn't covered it. Who has covered it? Well, The Atlantic has covered it. That's not the business press. But the only other mainstream outlet that I could find that made any mention of this study and its results was the Wall Street Journal. So the business press is willing to talk about this issue, whereas outlets like Huffington Post or Gizmodo or Breitbart, or even more mainstream outlets like, say, Time or Newsweek, it is not in their interest to acknowledge that such a thing as a perception gap exists. So this is not a sponsored video. I've had no interaction with the Financial Times other than taking that $1 4-week subscription. But the Financial Times is like $65 a month or something like that. I mean, it's a pretty expensive subscription for, what is a digital subscription. And yet, looking at my screen right now, I see I've got 9. I have 9 tabs open to stories in the Financial Times. So, at the end of my my month's trial subscription, I'm going to have a serious decision to make. I gave up my Adobe software suite because it was costing me $55 a month, and I was basically paying for the familiarity of the interface rather than, using alternatives which I could just buy outright or which were free. It would seem absurd that somebody like me, definitely not in the financial class, definitely not in the ownership class or the investment class, would pay that kind of money each month for a subscription to the Financial Times, but I'm actually considering it. What do you think about that? Post your comments below. And like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. And tune back in tomorrow, because I'll be talking to you again. Stay well.